The Arizona territory breathed a dry, patient heat, even after the sun had bled out behind the western mesas. It was late summer in the year 1879, a time when the day's furnace merely banked its coals for the night, waiting for dawn to stoke them again. The wind, when it came, was no relief. It was the slow exhalation of the desert itself, carrying the scent of dust and distant, unseen rain. Red rock formations stood against a sky littered with stars, their shapes like the ancient bones of creatures that had walked this land when it was an ocean floor. Roman Nantan moved through this landscape not as a visitor, but as a part of it. The soles of his moccasins knew the precise give of the sandy soil, the sharp protest of unseen shale. At 30, his face was a map drawn by sun and wind, his eyes holding the quiet watchfulness of a man who understood that the desert's silence was full of language. He had once worn the blue coat of an army scout, guiding soldiers who saw this land as an enemy to be conquered. He had learned their tongue, their ways, and the particular emptiness in their eyes. Then he had left them, trading the stale bread of their forts for the taste of freedom and the hard work of catching wild horses. Each horse sold was a step closer to his own piece of land, a parcel near a spring that did not fail in the dry season. Where there is water, his father had taught him, there is a future. That was the only creed he needed. He was tracking a single Mustang, a fine buckskin that had split from its band. The tracks were fresh, leading him toward the shallow cut of Bitter Wash, a place that lived up to its name most of the year. But recent rains meant there might be pools, enough to draw a thirsty animal. He moved with an economy of motion, a stillness in his stride that made him just another shadow among many. And then he heard it. It was not the cry of a night bird or the yip of a distant coyote. It was a voice, a woman's voice, singing softly. The sound was so out of place in the vast, stern emptiness that for a moment, Roman thought it was a spirit, a ghost of the water. He froze, letting the sound wash over him. It was a sad, simple melody, fragile as a moth's wing against the immense backdrop of the night. He followed the sound, his hunter's instincts replaced by a deep and unsettling curiosity. He came to the edge of the wash and looked down. A sliver of moon hung in the sky, its light turning the shallow pools of water to hammered silver. And in the largest of these pools stood a woman. Her back was to him, her skin so pale it seemed to drink the moonlight. Her hair, unbound, was a dark cascade down her back. She was bathing, her movements slow and weary, the song a murmur that was more for herself than for any listener. Roman knew he should leave. He knew it with a certainty that went bone deep. A white woman, alone, in the middle of Chiricahua land, was trouble of a kind that could get a man killed. But as he began to back away, her song hitched on a sob. The sound was small, but it struck him with the force of a physical blow. He stayed, hidden in the brush, an unwilling guardian. Her name was Eliza Hart, though she was trying hard to forget that. She had been walking for days, following the North Star, away from the life she had fled in Colorado. She had escaped a grand house where the windows were always closed and the silence was thick with menace. Her husband, Edwin Whitcomb, a man whose fortune was built on the silver he tore from the mountains, had a touch that was as cold and hard as his treasure. He saw her as another possession, a beautiful, well-bred ornament from Boston to be displayed and controlled. The last time he had raised a hand to her, something inside her had finally broken free. She had taken what little money she could find, a spare dress and a piece of bread. And she had run. A kind freighter had given her a ride south before his route changed, leaving her with a canteen of water and a vague direction toward a town called Santa Esperanza. Hope. The name had seemed a bitter joke as the days wore on. Now, the water of the creek felt like a blessing, washing away the grime and the fear. If only for a moment. The moonlight was a soft blanket on her skin. She had never felt so alone. Yet, in a strange way, she had never felt so free. The song was one her mother used to sing, a tune of lost love and faraway shores. She let the tears come, mingling with the water on her face. As she turned to step out of the pool, her foot slipped on a slick, algae-covered rock. She cried out, a sharp gasp of pain and surprise, as her ankle twisted beneath her and she fell back into the water with a splash. Before she could fully register what had happened, a figure emerged from the shadows on the bank. He was tall and lean, moving with a swift, silent grace that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. An Apache, her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. This was how it ended. All her running, all her desperate hope, would end here in this lonely place. Roman reached her in 2 long strides. He saw the pure terror in her eyes, wide and luminous in the moonlight. He deliberately looked away from her, his gaze fixed on the far bank of the wash as he reached down. His hands were strong and sure as they closed around her upper arms, lifting her from the water as if she weighed nothing. He set her on the sandy bank and immediately stepped back, turning his body away to grant her a measure of privacy, without a word. He shrugged off the rough wool cloak he wore and held it out to her, his face still averted. Eliza stared at the offered garment, her mind struggling to catch up. He was not attacking her. He was helping her. Her teeth began to chatter, a combination of cold and shock. She took the cloak, her fingers brushing his. His skin was warm. She wrapped the heavy fabric around her shivering body, its coarse texture a strange comfort. It smelled of sage and wood smoke and horse. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was thin, unsteady. Roman finally looked at her. He took in the fine, pale features, the way she clutched the cloak around her like a shield. She was from the East. It was written in the delicate line of her jaw, the disciplined set of her shoulders, even in her fear. "You are hurt," he said. It was not a question. His English was good, colored with the softer tones of his own language. "My ankle," she managed, looking down. It was already beginning to swell. He knelt, his movements fluid. He examined her ankle with a gentle, impersonal touch, his fingers probing lightly. "It is not broken, but you cannot walk on it tonight." He stood up. "I have a fire, not far." Eliza hesitated. Every story she had ever heard, every whispered warning about savages in the wilderness, screamed at her to refuse, but the quiet dignity in his posture, the deliberate respect he had shown her, went against all of it, and she was cold, hurt, and utterly lost. To stay here alone was to invite a slower, more certain death. "All right," she said, her voice a little stronger. He nodded once. He built a small fire in the shelter of an overhanging rock, using dry wood that produced almost no smoke. A scout's fire. The flames cast a warm, flickering light on their faces. He passed her a piece of hard corn cake and a strip of dried meat without ceremony. Eliza ate, surprised by her own hunger. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds, the crackle of the fire and the vast, breathing quiet of the desert. "You have no horse," Roman stated. "No supplies." "I lost them," Eliza lied, the falsehood clumsy on her tongue. "Who do you travel with?" She looked into the fire, the flames dancing in her eyes. "No one." Roman absorbed this. A woman alone. It was worse than he thought. He felt a current of irritation. Not at her, but at the situation. The desert taught a man many things, and the first among them was to share water. The second was to mind your own path, because trouble spread like wildfire in this dry country. This woman was a walking storm of trouble. He knew what white men thought when they saw an Apache with a white woman. He had seen the consequences. Still, to leave her here would be to condemn her. His own code, the one taught to him by his people long before he met the army, would not allow it. "In the morning," he said, his voice flat. "I will take you to Cedar Spur. It is a trading post. You can find a way from there." Eliza looked at him, at the hard lines of his face softened by the firelight. There was no kindness in his expression, only a kind of stern resolution. But it was enough. "Thank you," she said again. And this time, the words carried the full weight of her gratitude. She had been shown a moment of grace in a world that had offered her none. The next day's journey was a silent, difficult affair. Roman found her a sturdy branch to use as a crutch. He walked ahead, his pace slowed to match hers, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He did not speak, and Eliza, sensing his reluctance, did not try to force a conversation. The sun beat down on them, and the landscape was a blur of brown and red and pale, washed-out blue. Cedar Spur was not a town. It was a collection of low, adobe buildings huddled around a dusty patch of ground, a place that seemed to be held together by heat and desperation. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed men, cheap whiskey, and manure. A few horses stood hip-shot at a hitching rail, their heads drooping in the afternoon glare. As they approached, a group of men on the porch of the main building stopped talking and turned to watch them. Their eyes lingered on Eliza, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and crude appraisal. She pulled Roman's cloak tighter around herself, her head down, feeling their stares like physical things. Roman felt a familiar tightening in his gut. He knew these men, or men just like them. They lived on a diet of suspicion and boredom, a dangerous combination. He guided Eliza toward the trading post, his face an impassive mask. Inside, the air was cooler but heavy with the smells of leather, tobacco, and flour. A burly man with a stained apron stood behind a counter, but it was another man, sitting alone at a small table in the corner, who drew Roman's attention. He was wiry and looked as if he had been baked in the sun, his clothes worn but his gun belt well cared for. He watched them with pale, unblinking eyes. A bounty hunter, Roman guessed. The man's gaze kept flicking to Eliza. Before Roman could speak to the trader, one of the men from the porch swaggered in, followed by two of his friends. He was big, with a vacant, liquor-fueled confidence in his eyes. "Well now," the man said, his voice loud in the quiet room. "Look what the Apache dragged in. You find yourself a pretty little thing out there in the sagebrush, Chief." Eliza flinched. Roman stepped slightly in front of her, his body a solid shield. He said nothing, his silence more potent than any threat. The big man was not deterred. "What is the matter? She do not speak English. I bet I could teach her a few words." He took a step closer, a greasy smile on his face. Roman knew this could go bad very quickly. A fight here would solve nothing and attract the wrong kind of attention, especially from the man in the corner. He needed to end this now. In a way these men would understand. He needed to give them a reason to leave her alone, a reason that made sense in their world of ownership and property. He turned his head slightly, his dark eyes meeting the big man's stare. His voice was low and calm, but it cut through the thick air like a knife. "Be careful what you say," Roman said. "You are speaking about my wife." The words dropped into the silence, heavy and unexpected. The big man blinked, his smile faltering. The other men shifted on their feet. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She stared at Roman's back, her mind reeling. His wife. The bounty hunter in the corner, a man named Burke Slater, leaned forward just slightly. His interest piqued. He had come to Cedar Spur on a rumor, a whisper about a high-society wife from Colorado who had vanished. A woman with a $1,000 price on her head, offered by her wealthy husband, Edwin Whitcomb. A woman with distinctive red hair. The woman huddled in the Apache's cloak had a hat pulled low, but he could see a few strands of it, glinting like copper in a stray sunbeam. The big man grumbled something under his breath and, after a moment's hesitation, backed away, his friends shuffling out behind him. In their world, even an Apache's wife was off limits. Roman turned to the trader, ignoring both Eliza's shocked expression and the continued scrutiny of the man in the corner. He bought supplies, flour, coffee, and bandages. As he paid, he felt Slater's eyes on his back. This was not over. The lie had worked for a moment, but it had also painted a fresh target on them. Outside, the air seemed even hotter, more oppressive. The distant call of a coyote, Strange in the middle of the day. Sounded like a warning. "Why did you say that?" Eliza asked, her voice a fierce whisper. "It was the only word they would respect," Roman answered, his eyes scanning the area. "Now we must go." "Go where you said you would leave me here." "I cannot," he said, his jaw tight. "That man inside, the one watching, he is a hunter, and I think you are what he is hunting." Just then, Slater emerged from the trading post. He walked toward his horse, but his eyes were on them. He gave them a slow, knowing smile that did not reach his cold eyes. "You take good care of your new bride." "Apache," Slater called out, his voice laced with mocking politeness. "Pretty thing like that. A man would want to hold on to her." He looked directly at Eliza, his eyes lingering on the strands of her hair. "This is not over," he said, his voice dropping so only they could hear. Then he swung into his saddle and rode away, not fast, but with a purpose that was deeply unnerving. Roman watched him go. He had seen enough. The main roads were no longer safe. The lie had bought them a little time, but it had also tied them together. He looked at Eliza, at the fear and confusion in her eyes. "There are other trails," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Apache trails. He will not find us there." He made the decision in that instant. Her trouble was now his. He would take her not to the next town, but through the heart of the country he knew, a land that would either shelter them or swallow them whole. He did not know her name, or where she came from, but he had called her his wife. In the harsh logic of the desert, that made it true enough for now. They left the simmering dust of cedar spur behind, trading the well-worn wagon ruts for a path that was little more than a whisper on the land. Roman moved with a steady, ground-eating pace, and Eliza followed. Her world narrowed to the sight of his broad back and the constant, throbbing complaint of her ankle. The desert they entered now was different. The trails used by white men followed the path of least resistance, seeking out water and avoiding the harshest terrain. The Apache trails were woven into the landscape itself, a secret language written in stone and shadow. They climbed over ridges of sun-baked rock that would have seemed impassable, and descended into narrow, winding canyons that hid them from the vast, open sky. At first, Eliza's fear was a cold knot in her stomach. Every strange sound, every rustle in the dry brush, sent a jolt of panic through her. She was a woman from Boston, a creature of cobblestone streets and gas-lit drawing rooms. This world of thorns and unforgiving sunlight was as alien to her as the surface of the moon. Her fine leather shoes, already scuffed and worn, were no match for the sharp rocks. Her dress, made for afternoon teas, was torn and stained. She was being stripped of her old life, layer by layer, until all that was left was the raw, struggling person underneath. Roman seemed to notice everything and say little. When her ankle finally gave way and she tumbled onto the gravelly soil, scraping her palm, he did not rush to her with words of comfort. He simply stopped, waiting for her to get to her feet. When she stood, biting her lip against the sting, he gestured to a plant with tough, fibrous leaves. "The bark of this one," he said, his voice as even as the horizon, "when chewed, makes a poultice. It keeps the wound clean." He demonstrated, stripping a piece of bark and working it in his jaw before applying the paste to a small cut on his own arm. He then handed her a fresh piece. The lesson was clear in this place. Sympathy was a luxury, but knowledge was survival. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of a relentless sun. Eliza learned a new catechism. She learned that the slight shimmer of leaves on a distant cottonwood tree meant water was near the surface. She learned that the direction the tiny flowers of the creosote bush faced could tell you the time of day. She learned to walk not with her eyes on her feet, but with her gaze scanning the terrain ahead, reading the subtle shifts in color and texture that Roman called the desert's map. One afternoon, as they rested in the thin shade of a palo verde tree, their water supply dangerously low, she watched him slice into the thick, spiny leaf of a yucca plant. He held it up, The plant wears a skin that catches the morning dew, he explained, scraping a few precious, glistening drops into a small cup he had fashioned from a gourd. The white man calls it Spanish dagger. My people call it the hand of the sky. It gives what it can. The water was barely enough to wet her tongue, but it tasted of life itself. It was in these small moments that the layers of her old world began to peel away, replaced by a new and startling clarity. The ironclad rules of Boston society seemed absurd out here. What did it matter which fork one used when the most important question was where to find the next drink of water? Their conversations started as sparse, practical exchanges. We rest here. The footing is loose, but slowly. A fragile trust began to sprout in the arid soil between them. It was fueled by a cautious curiosity. You do not speak like other army scouts I have met, Eliza observed one evening as they shared a small rabbit Roman had snared. He shrugged, turning the meat over the smokeless fire. I listened. Most of them only talked. You mean they only talked, she corrected gently, the habit of a lifetime too ingrained to stop. A rare smile touched the corners of his mouth, a brief flash of warmth in his serious face. Out here, the only grammar that matters is water. Eliza found herself smiling back, a real smile, not the polite, practiced expression she had worn for years. I suppose it is. She hesitated, then asked, Why did you leave them, the army? The smile vanished. He stared into the fire, his face closed once more. They wanted me to lead them against my own people. I took their pay to guide them, not to help them kill my kin. The words were quiet, but heavy with a pain she could not yet understand. She saw then the conflict within him, the ghost of a man caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. Her own internal battle raged just as fiercely. In the quiet of the night, with the star-dusted sky arching overhead, the teachings of her past would return to her. A lady does not travel unchaperoned with a man, especially not a savage. A wife's duty is to her husband, no matter how difficult he may be. The words of her father, her minister, the whole of Boston society, echoed in her mind, accusing her of being reckless, fallen, and ruined. She should turn back. She should find the nearest town and send a telegram to Edwin, begging his forgiveness. But then the memory of his face would rise before her, his eyes cold with rage, the feel of his hand on her arm like a manacle, and the instinct for survival, an instinct she never knew she possessed, would roar to life. It was a wild, powerful thing, and it told her to keep walking, to keep following this quiet, capable man who had, for whatever reason, chosen to protect her. The sandstorm came upon them without warning. One moment the sky was a clear, brilliant blue. The next, the horizon turned a sickly yellow, and the wind began to moan through the canyons. Roman stopped, sniffing the air like an animal. We must find shelter, he said, his voice sharp with urgency. He grabbed her hand, his grip firm, and pulled her along. They scrambled up a rock face to a shallow cave he had spotted, a dark mouth in the side of the cliff. They were barely inside when the world outside dissolved into a screaming, blinding whirlwind of sand. The noise was a physical assault, a continuous roar that vibrated through the rock. Sand, fine as flour, seeped into the cave, coating everything. They huddled together in the back, the space so small their shoulders touched. For hours, they sat in the roaring darkness, the storm erasing the world. It was an enforced intimacy, a shared vulnerability that went deeper than words. When the wind finally began to die down, Roman uncorked his canteen. Eliza could see that it was less than a quarter full, their last water. Without a word, he offered it to her. She looked from the canteen to his face, barely visible in the gloom. His lips were cracked, his face caked with dust. She took the canteen, raised it to her lips, and took only the smallest sip before handing it back. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement of her sacrifice, and took a sip himself. In that simple exchange, something profound shifted between them. They were no longer just a man and a woman, an Apache and a Bostonian. They were two people keeping each other alive. The world the storm left behind was new and clean, the air scoured and fresh. It was as if the desert had been given a second chance. Eliza felt it in herself, a sense of renewal, of possibility. That evening, as they sat by their small fire, she knew she had to trust him completely. She reached into a hidden pocket sewn into the lining of her petticoat and pulled out a small, folded piece of deerskin. It was soft and worn, the markings on it drawn in charcoal. The lines were shaky, drawn by a hand that was old or unwell. "When I first ran away," she began, her voice low, "I fell ill. A fever. I do not know how long I was unconscious. When I woke, I was in a small hut. An old woman was taking care of me. An Apache woman." Roman looked up from sharpening his knife, his full attention on her now. "She gave me herbs and water. She never told me her name. When I was strong enough to leave, she gave me this." Eliza unfolded the map. "She said it was for her son. She said he would understand it. She told me, if I was ever truly lost, I should follow it. She said it would lead to a safe place." Roman reached for the map. His fingers, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he took it. He stared at the charcoal lines, his expression unreadable. He traced one of the symbols, a stylized drawing of a balanced rock. "Cash Rock," he whispered, the name rough in his throat. He looked at Eliza, and for the first time she saw a profound and aching sorrow in his eyes. "The markings. This was my mother's hand. Her name was Alona. She was a healer, a midwife." The revelation hung in the air between them, as stunning and unexpected as the sandstorm. The anonymous act of kindness that had saved Eliza's life was not random. It was a thread, connecting her to this man, to his past. The journey was no longer just a flight from danger. It now had a destination, a purpose. They traveled for 2 more days, a new sense of quiet companionship between them. The map was their guide, but Roman barely needed it. He knew the way. Cash Rock was a place of his childhood, a landmark of his memory. It was a towering formation of red rock, one massive boulder balanced precariously on another, a sentinel overlooking the surrounding plains. Roman led her to the base of the rock, to a place hidden by a thick growth of juniper. He knelt and began to move smaller stones, revealing a cleverly concealed hollow. From within, he lifted a heavy leather pouch, dark with age and stiff to the touch. It was tied with a rawhide thong. They sat together on the ground as he opened it. The contents had been packed with care. The first thing he pulled out was a small, leather-bound book. It was a journal, filled with his mother's elegant script, a mix of Apache symbols and Spanish words. The air filled with the faint, dry scent of medicinal herbs that seemed to cling to its pages. Next came a sheaf of folded papers, official-looking documents from a territorial office. Roman unfolded them carefully. They were identity papers, but the name written on them made Eliza gasp. They were made out for a woman named Catherine Moore. No, not Catherine. He looked closer. The first name was smudged, but it looked for all the world like Eliza. Eliza Moore. Beneath the name was a description, widow, of mixed heritage, born in the territory. It was a new identity, a safe identity, a way for a woman to disappear and start again, shielded from a past that might be hunting her. His mother, the wise Alona, had prepared an escape for someone. The fact that it bore Eliza's name felt like a sign, a piece of impossible magic in the heart of the wilderness. At the very bottom of the pouch was a small, folded piece of hide. Roman opened it. On it, in his mother's hand, was a single, simple sentence written in Spanish. He translated it for Eliza, his voice thick with emotion. "Choose your family with your heart." They sat in silence as the sun began to set, painting the face of Cash Rock in hues of orange and deep purple. The world had cracked open, revealing a legacy of hope and a mother's love that reached across the years. For Roman, It was a reunion with a ghost. For Eliza, it was the promise of a future she had never dared to imagine. They had come to this place as fugitives, but they had found something more than a refuge. They had found a legacy. The pouch his mother had left felt heavy with more than just its physical contents. It was a weight of responsibility, a legacy of hope that Roman had never asked for but now felt bound to honor. The papers naming Eliza Moore, a woman of mixed heritage, a widow, were a key, a potential escape from the life that hunted her. His mother, with her healer's foresight, had seen a need and prepared a remedy long before the sickness was known. As they traveled away from Cache Rock, the silence between them was different. It was no longer the silence of strangers sharing a path, but the quiet of two people contemplating a shared, uncertain future. The land they crossed was still harsh, but the discovery had planted a seed of purpose in the barren ground of their flight. They could not live on the land forever. They needed salt, more ammunition, and proper supplies if they were to make a real journey toward the town of Santa Esperanza. The name, Hope, no longer seemed like a joke to Eliza. It felt like a destination whispered on the wind. The nearest place to provision was a trading post called Bitter Springs, larger and more frequented than Cedar Spur. It was a risk. A wolf does not return to a valley where it has been seen, and Slater was a wolf of a particularly patient and persistent kind, but they had no choice. Necessity was its own map, drawing its own unforgiving lines across the territory. Bitter Springs baked under the midday sun, a handful of adobe buildings shimmering in the heat. A sluggish rhythm of life pulsed from the saloon, the clank of a blacksmith's hammer providing a steady, monotonous beat. As they walked down the single dusty street, leading the sturdy pony Roman had acquired in a trade for a well-tanned hide, Eliza felt 100 eyes on them. Here, the sight of an Apache man and a white woman, her face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, was not just a curiosity. It was a story waiting to be told, and most of the men lounging on the porches preferred violent endings. Roman's hand rested near the pistol at his hip, his movements calm and deliberate. His gaze swept over the street, cataloging every man, every horse, every open doorway. He saw him before Eliza did. Burke Slater was leaning against the wall of the general store as if he had been waiting for them all morning. He was not alone. 2 other men stood with him, both with the same hard, empty look in their eyes. They were the kind of men who drifted from one dirty job to the next, their loyalty for sale to the highest bidder. Slater pushed himself off the wall, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his sun-cracked face. He took a few steps forward, blocking their path. "Well, look here," Slater said, his voice carrying an oily tone of false surprise. "If it is not the happy couple, I was just telling my associates here about you. A real romantic tale." The 2 men with him fanned out slightly, their hands hovering near their guns. It was a classic trap, and they were walking right into it. "We have no business with you," Roman said, his voice low and even. He stopped, placing himself squarely between Eliza and the bounty hunter. "Oh, I think you do," Slater purred. He took his hat off in a mocking gesture of respect. His eyes fixed on Eliza. "Ma'am, my apologies for the misunderstanding back at Cedar Spur. My name is Burke Slater. I have been hired by your husband, Mr. Edwin Whitcomb, to ensure your safe return. He is terribly worried about you." Eliza felt a wave of nausea. The sound of her husband's name spoken aloud in this place made her skin crawl. Slater's pretense of chivalry was more terrifying than any open threat. He was painting a picture for the onlookers, casting himself as the rescuer and Roman as the savage kidnapper. "He knows you must be frightened," Slater continued, his voice dripping with synthetic sympathy. "Taken from your life, dragged through this wilderness by him. But it is all over now. We are here to take you home." This was the moment, the pivot on which her entire future would turn. The old Eliza, the woman from Boston, would have shrunk back, stammered, or burst into tears, allowing Slater to control the narrative completely. But the woman who had survived the desert, who had learned to find water from a yucca and dress her own wounds, was not that woman. She had been given a new name in a leather pouch, a name that meant freedom. She had to be worthy of it. Before Roman could speak, before he could draw his weapon and end things in a hail of gunfire, Eliza stepped out from behind him. She moved with a calm assurance that stunned even herself. She laid her hand on Roman's arm, a gesture of clear and deliberate possession. She lifted her chin and met Slater's cold gaze without flinching. "There must be some mistake." "Sir," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the dusty street. "My husband is standing right here." She tightened her grip on Roman's arm. "I am Mrs. Nantan, and we were just on our way to purchase supplies." The sheer audacity of it left Slater speechless for a beat. His smile faltered. His two hired guns exchanged a confused glance. Of all the things he had expected, this quiet, defiant performance was not one of them. He had anticipated tears, fear, a plea for rescue. Instead, he got a woman claiming to be an Apache's wife and looking him in the eye as if he were the one who was out of place. Roman did not miss the opportunity she had created. While Slater and his men were momentarily off balance, he turned to the doorway of the cantina beside them. An older Mexican man, the proprietor, stood there, wiping a glass, his dark eyes taking in everything. Roman addressed him in the fluid, rapid Spanish he had learned as a boy. "Friend," Roman said, his tone urgent but respectful. "It appears these gentlemen wish to cause trouble. My wife and I mean no harm to this town. Please, make sure any women or children stay inside. I would not want anyone to be hurt by their foolishness." The proprietor's eyes flicked from Roman to Eliza, then to Slater's hard face. He gave a curt nod, his expression hardening. He understood. He disappeared back into the shadows of the cantina, shouting orders in Spanish. The message was clear. Roman was not just some lone Apache. He was a man who respected the community, a man trying to de-escalate, while Slater and his men were outsiders bringing violence to their doorstep. The social ground had shifted. Slater recovered, his face twisting into a sneer. "A cute little show, but it does not change who you are. You are Eliza Whitcomb, and you are coming with me. The law in this territory is on my side." "The law does not allow you to threaten a man's wife," Roman said, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "She is not your wife," Slater snarled, losing his composure. "She is property, his property, and I'm here to collect." One of the hired guns, a lanky man with a nervous tic, decided to force the issue. His hand twitched and dropped toward his pistol. It was a fatal miscalculation. Roman's draw was not a blur of motion like the dime novel gunslingers. It was something more elemental. A movement so economical and swift it seemed as if the gun simply appeared in his hand. There were two sharp cracks, so close together they sounded almost like one. The lanky man cried out and crumpled to the ground, his hand clutching a shattered knee. The second man grunted as if punched in the gut, a dark stain blossoming on his shoulder as he was spun around, his own gun clattering into the dust. Roman had not killed them. He had not even aimed to kill them. It was the deliberate, disciplined action of a warrior, not a murderer. He had dismantled the threat, piece by piece. He now stood with his pistol leveled at the center of Slater's chest. The bounty hunter was frozen, his hand halfway to his own gun, his face a mask of shocked disbelief. A heavy silence descended on the street, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded man. Doors had slammed shut, windows were filled with pale, watching faces. Roman had won, but in doing so, he had proven Slater's point. He had brought violence. The law, when it arrived, would not care who drew first. They would only see a wounded white man and an Apache holding a smoking gun. "You are a dead man, Apache," Slater whispered, his voice shaking with fury. "Perhaps," Roman said, "but not today, and not by your hand. Leave the money for your men with the bartender. Get on your horse, and ride away from here." With his options gone, and Roman's unwavering gaze upon him, Slater slowly, deliberately, lowered his hand. He backed away, his eyes burning with a hatred that was pure and absolute. He mounted his horse, and without a backward glance at his fallen companions, he spurred the animal into a gallop, disappearing in a cloud of dust. Roman did not wait. He holstered his pistol, took the pony's reins, and grabbed Eliza's arm. "We are leaving, now." They moved quickly, not looking back. The town of Bitter Springs was no longer a place of potential supply, but a monument to their escalating danger. They rode hard for the rest of the day, pushing eastward, toward the distant, hazy line of the mountains. When they finally stopped, the sun was setting, and the reality of their situation settled upon them. They were fugitives. Slater would not give up. He would go to the nearest territorial marshal and tell a story of a brave rescue attempt and a savage ambush. Edwin Whitcomb's money would ensure that the story was believed. "We cannot keep running like this," Eliza said, her voice strained. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. "Sooner or later, they will corner us." Roman nodded, staring into the gathering dark. "You are right. We do not need a hiding place. We need a sanctuary." He looked at her, his expression grim. "There is a place, a mission. San Miguel. It is a long ride, but the priest there, Padre Raphael, is a good man. He knew my mother. He believes in God's law more than the territories." As he spoke, a faint, clear sound drifted to them on the evening breeze. It was a bell, distant, melodic, impossibly pure in the vast, harsh landscape. It was the evening call to prayer from the mission, a sound that cut through the oppressive heat and the suffocating fear. It sounded like hope. It sounded like the only kind of law that might be able to save them now. The journey to San Miguel took them 3 days. When they finally saw it, it was like an apparition. Its white adobe walls a stark and beautiful contrast to the red earth of the surrounding hills. The mission stood as a testament to a different kind of endurance, one built not on violence, but on faith. Padre Raphael was as Roman had described him. He was an old man, his skin the color of tanned leather, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, but his eyes were bright and keenly intelligent. "Missing nothing?" He greeted Roman with a warm embrace, calling him Hijo, son. He looked at Eliza with a gentle curiosity, his gaze taking in her torn dress, her exhausted face, and the way she stood close to Roman. He led them into his cool, quiet study, the air smelling of old books and beeswax. He listened patiently as they told him a carefully edited version of their story. They spoke of a disagreement with a powerful man, of threats, of a journey that had become a flight for their lives. They did not speak of marriage, or of the lies they had told. They did not need to. When they were finished, the old priest was silent for a long time. He looked from Roman's proud, worried face to Eliza's defiant, frightened one. He saw the truth they were not speaking. He saw a man bound by an unexpected honor and a woman fighting for her very soul. "The law of this territory is a complicated thing," Padre Raphael said at last, his voice a soft, raspy whisper. "It is often bought and sold, like any other commodity. Mr. Whitcomb is a very rich man. His reach is long." He leaned forward, his dark eyes holding theirs. "Sanctuary within these walls is a sacred right, and I will grant it to you. You are safe here, for now." A wave of relief washed over Eliza so powerful it almost buckled her knees. "But you must understand," the priest continued, his expression grave. "These walls are made of mud and straw. They cannot hold back a federal marshal with a warrant forever. This protection is temporary, a bandage, not a cure." He folded his hands on the worn wooden surface of his desk. "If you wish to truly be free of this man, if you want to sever the legal reins he holds on you, sanctuary is not enough. There is only one thing in the eyes of the law, and in the eyes of God, that can break the bond of a marriage." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the quiet room. "Another marriage." Padre Raphael's words settled in the small study not with the force of a thunderclap, but with the quiet, inexorable weight of a closing door. Another marriage. The idea was so monstrous, so utterly unthinkable, that Eliza felt the air leave her lungs. To escape one cage only to willingly walk into another seemed a cruelty beyond measure. She looked at Roman. His face was like carved stone, his expression giving nothing away. But she saw a muscle tighten along his jaw. He was a man who valued his freedom above all else. The thought of being legally bound must have felt like a chain around his neck. The old priest gave them time, his silence a respectful space for the magnitude of his suggestion to sink in. He poured 3 small glasses of cool water from an earthenware jug, his movements slow and deliberate. "It is not a proposal of the heart," he said softly, as if sensing their turmoil. "It is a strategy, a legal shield. We call it a matrimonio por necesidad, a marriage of necessity. The Church recognizes such arrangements when they are for the protection of life and soul. More importantly, the territorial government in Santa Fe will recognize it. Once the record is filed, Edwin Whitcomb's claim on you becomes null. In the eyes of the law, you cannot be another man's wife if you are already married." "And what would this arrangement require?" Eliza asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Vows," the priest answered simply. "Before me and 2 witnesses, your names, entered into the mission ledger. I would have a copy sent by courier to the territorial clerk in Santa Fe. It would be a legal fact, as solid as these adobe walls." They left the study and walked out into the mission courtyard. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows from the arches of the cloister. In the distance, the peaks of the Sierra Blanca mountains were just visible, their highest points still dusted with a stubborn, year-round snow. The sight of it, so pure and white against the harsh blue sky, felt like a vision from another world. It was a symbol of an innocence that Eliza felt she had lost long ago. Roman led her to a stone bench under a gnarled olive tree. He did not speak for a long time, his gaze fixed on those distant, snow-capped peaks. "He is right," Roman said at last, his voice low and rough. "Slater will not stop. Whitcomb's money will buy him a dozen more men and a marshal's badge to make it legal. They will hunt you, and because I am with you, they will hunt me." He turned to look at her, his dark eyes serious. "This is the only path that makes their hunt illegal. It turns you from his property into my wife. In their world, that is a line they will be more hesitant to cross." "And you?" Eliza asked, her heart aching for the sacrifice he was considering. "What about your freedom, your plan to buy land?" "Land is no good to a dead man," he said, the words stark and practical. "And my freedom means nothing if I leave you to them. My mother saved your life. That created a debt. I called you my wife to protect you at Cedar Spur. That created a responsibility. My path is no longer my own. It is tied to yours now." He looked away again, back at the mountains. "This is a thing of paper, a legal trick. Nothing more needs to change between us." She understood what he was not saying. He was offering her a name, a shield, but he was asking for nothing in return. It was an act of profound, almost unbelievable honor. She thought of her first wedding, a grand affair in a Boston cathedral, filled with flowers and promises that had turned to dust and ashes. She had been sold, a beautiful asset in a business merger, her own heart and soul never entering the negotiation. Now, in this dusty courtyard, she was being offered a true sanctuary, a marriage based not on possession but on protection. It was a strange and terrifying choice, but it was her choice to make. "All right," she said, her voice finding a strength she did not know it possessed. "I will do it." The ceremony took place the next evening in the mission's small, candle-lit chapel. The air was cool and smelled of old wood, melting wax, and the faint, sweet scent of desert flowers that someone had placed on the simple altar. There were no guests, only the necessary witnesses, the old Mexican proprietor from the cantina in Bitter Springs, who had brought them a warning about Slater's return, and a quiet, elderly nun who tended the mission's garden. Eliza wore a simple dress the nun had given her, clean and mended. Her fiery red hair, the beacon that had made her so easy to track, was braided and pinned up. Roman stood beside her, not in his rough trail clothes, but in a clean cotton shirt and trousers. He looked taller, somehow more formidable, in the flickering light. Padre Raphael's voice was a soft, steady murmur as he recited the rites in a mixture of Latin and Spanish. When it came time for the rings, Eliza felt a pang of panic. They had nothing, but the priest was prepared. He produced a simple silver band, inlaid with a small, smooth stone of blue-green turquoise. "A gift," he said, "from myself and Senor Alvarez, the freighter who brought your warning. It is a humble thing, silver from the earth, turquoise from the sky, a reminder of the bond between the two." Roman took the ring. His fingers were warm and steady as he slid it onto her finger. It was cool against her skin. When it was her turn, she simply placed her hand on his, a silent vow that was deeper than any words she could have spoken. They signed their names in the heavy leather ledger Roman Nantan, Eliza Moore, the name his mother had prepared for her. With the scratch of the pen, Eliza Hart Whitcomb ceased to exist. That night, they were given a small, clean room in a quiet corner of the mission. It had a single bed, a wooden washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a window that opened onto the star-filled desert sky. An almost unbearable awkwardness settled between them. They were husband and wife, a fact recorded in a book and soon to be filed in Santa Fe, but they were still two strangers, bound together by danger and necessity. Roman stood by the window, his back to her, looking out at the night. Eliza sat on the edge of the bed, her hands twisting in her lap, her body rigid with a tension she could not name. She felt the ghost of her life with Edwin, the dread that had always accompanied the closing of a bedroom door. She had been his wife, but she had never been safe. Finally, Roman turned from the window. The moonlight sculpted his face, making the familiar lines and angles seem new and strange. He took a step toward the bed, and Eliza froze. She did not scream. She did not cry out. She simply went still, a perfect, silent statue of terror. Her breathing became shallow, her eyes wide and fixed on some point in the middle distance. It was a reaction born of long practice, the instinctive defense of a creature that has learned that stillness is the only way to endure the inevitable. Roman stopped instantly. He saw it all in that one terrible moment. He saw not just the fear of a stranger, but the deep, ingrained terror of a woman who had known nothing but cruelty in the guise of intimacy. He had seen that same look in the eyes of a horse that had been badly broken, a spirit that had been beaten into submission. He understood then that the innocence he had sensed in her that first night at Bitterwash was not of the body. It was of the soul, her trust, her hope, her belief in the gentleness of a man's touch, had never been honored. It was as pure and untouched as the snow on the distant Sierra Blanca. A wave of something fierce and protective rose in him, an anger directed not at her, but at the man who had done this. He had offered her a legal shield, but he saw now that her wounds were far deeper than any law could reach. He backed away slowly, deliberately, giving her space. He walked to the foot of the bed and picked up a coarse wool blanket that had been folded there. He unfolded it and, moving with infinite care, he draped it over her rigid shoulders. His touch was light, impersonal, the way one would comfort a frightened child or a shivering animal. He did not speak for a long time. He went back to the window, giving her the safety of distance. "The stars are different here than in the east," he said, his voice soft, conversational, breaking the terrible silence. "My people have stories for them. We see the great bear, but we also see the coyote, running across the sky." He pointed. "That one, the bright one that does not flicker. That is the camp of the morning star, the one who brings the dawn. He is a warrior, but he is a patient one." Eliza listened, her rigid posture beginning to soften under the warmth of the blanket. His voice was a low, soothing melody, telling stories of a world she did not know. "My father taught me that love is like a fire," he continued, his gaze still on the heavens. "The white man often treats it like a wildfire, something that burns hot and fast and consumes everything in its path. But that is not love. That is just hunger." He turned his head, his profile silhouetted against the stars. "My people believe love is the campfire. It must be built carefully. It must be fed and tended. You must know when to give it air, and when to bank the coals to keep it safe through the night. If you are careless, it will burn you. If you neglect it, it will die. But if you respect it, it will give you warmth and light for a lifetime." He fell silent. The only sound was Eliza's breathing, which was no longer shallow and panicked, but deep and ragged with unshed tears. A single tear escaped and traced a hot path down her cheek. Then another. Soon, she was crying, not with the loud, hysterical sobs of her past life, but with the quiet, wrenching grief of a soul that was, for the first time, being allowed to mourn. She wept for the girl she had been, for the cruelty she had endured, and for the simple, profound kindness of the man who stood across the room. Roman did not move to comfort her. He understood that this was a grief she had to pass through alone. He simply stood his watch, his presence a silent promise of safety. When her sobs finally subsided into a weary quiet, he spoke again, his voice still gentle. "You are safe here. Eliza," he said, using her name for the first time. "I will not harm you. You have my word." And in that moment, she believed him. The rigid knot of fear that she had carried for years began to dissolve. From the ashes of a marriage of necessity, something new and fragile was born. They began to call each other husband and wife in their own minds, not because of a piece of paper, but because of a shared promise in a moonlit room. The next morning, Eliza was a different woman. The night had been a crucible, burning away the last vestiges of the frightened creature she had been. She sought out Roman in the courtyard where he was checking the straps on his saddle. "My hair," she said, her voice firm. "This color is a danger to us. The nuns use walnut husks to dye their wool. I will ask them to teach me. I will make it a dark brown, less noticeable." Roman looked at her, surprised by her sudden decisiveness. He nodded. "It is a good idea." "And I want you to teach me to use a pistol," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "I will not be helpless again. I need to be able to protect myself, to protect us." This gave him pause, but he saw the determination in her eyes, and he knew she was right. "I will teach you," he agreed. "And there is one more thing," she said. "The nun, Sister Teresa, she weaves beautiful blankets. I want to learn. I need a skill, a trade. If we are to make a life in Santa Esperanza, I will not be a burden. I will contribute." Roman looked at this woman, his wife, and felt a surge of admiration so strong it almost took his breath away. She was not just surviving anymore. She was planning. She was fighting. The snows of the Sierra Blanca were not melting. They were gathering their strength, preparing for the long journey down the mountain. Their fragile peace was shattered 2 days later. A young boy from the nearby pueblo brought a message for Padre Raphael. The priest found them in the garden, where Eliza was learning the proper way to hold a revolver, its weight unfamiliar but reassuring in her hand. The Padre's face was grim. "The message is from a friend in Tucson," he said, his voice heavy. "Edwin Whitcomb has doubled the bounty on you, Eliza, and he has put a new price on your head. Roman. He has hired a dozen more men. Slater is leading them, and they are not just riding as bounty hunters anymore. They have convinced a territorial marshal that you are a kidnapper and a murderer. They carry a federal warrant." The words hung in the warm, sunlit air. The mission walls suddenly felt very thin, very fragile. Their legal shield was just a piece of paper against a coming army. "You must leave," Padre Raphael said, his voice filled with sorrow. "You are no longer safe here. The marshal will not respect our sanctuary if he has a warrant." Roman looked at Eliza. Her face was pale. But her eyes were not filled with fear. They were filled with resolve. She was no longer running from something. Now, they were running toward something. Toward Santa Esperanza. Toward a life they would have to build together, or not at all. The journey to Santa Esperanza was not a desperate scramble, but a determined pilgrimage. They rode under the vast, indifferent sky, no longer just running from a past that hunted them, but pushing toward a future they had to invent for themselves. The lessons of the mission stayed with them. Eliza's hair, dyed a deep, rich brown with walnut husks, no longer blazed like a beacon. It was the color of good earth, allowing her to blend into the landscape. Each evening, after they made camp, Roman would patiently guide her through the mechanics of the revolver Padre Raphael had insisted they take. The weight of it in her hand was no longer alien. It was becoming a familiar, if somber, responsibility. They spoke more freely now, their conversations weaving a tapestry of their two different worlds. She told him of Boston, of gas lamps casting a golden glow on snowy streets and the hushed quiet of a great library. He told her of his childhood, of learning the stories of the stars and the language of the animals, a life lived in rhythm with the seasons, not the clock. They saw Santa Esperanza first as a smudge of brown against the blue backdrop of the distant mountains. As they drew closer, it resolved itself into a town that seemed to have grown organically from the soil. It was a jumble of weathered wood and sun-bleached adobe, a place that had not been planned but had simply happened. Unlike the stark, transient outposts of Cedar Spur and Bitter Springs, Santa Esperanza had the feel of a place where people had come to stay. Smoke curled from a dozen chimneys. The sound of children's laughter mingled with the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, and the air smelled of chili, horses, and dust. The town's population was a river of humanity, a confluence of the three currents that had shaped the territory. Stern-faced Anglo ranchers in dusty hats, Mexican families whose ancestors had been here for centuries, and Apache families who had chosen this life of compromise over the slow death of the reservations. They mixed in the streets and in the general store, their interactions a complex dance of necessity, suspicion, and a grudging, hard-won respect. For the first time since she had fled Colorado, Eliza did not feel like a complete anomaly. Here, everyone was, in some way, from somewhere else. Roman's first stop was the office of the town sheriff. It was a small, unassuming adobe building with a single barred window and a wooden sign that creaked in the breeze. The man who sat behind the desk looked as weathered as the town itself. He was broad-shouldered, and his face was a geography of sun and time, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. He looked up as they entered, his gaze taking in Roman first, then Eliza, lingering for a moment on the simple silver and turquoise ring on her finger. "Nantan," the sheriff said, his voice a low rumble. He did not smile, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "I heard you were catching mustangs up north." "My plans changed. Tom," Roman replied. "This is my wife, Eliza." Sheriff Tom Delgado stood up and nodded to Eliza, a gesture of respect that was not common in these parts. "Ma'am." He looked back at Roman, and a silent conversation passed between the two men. It spoke of a shared history, of a time years ago during a skirmish with bandits when Roman, then scouting for the army, had pulled a wounded Delgado from a ravine, saving his life under a hail of gunfire. It was a debt that had never been spoken of, but had never been forgotten. "We are looking to stay," Roman said simply. "Find work, build a life." Delgado leaned back in his chair, studying Roman. He knew Roman was a man of his word, a man who understood the desert's harsh justice. He also knew that Santa Esperanza was perpetually short on men he could truly trust. "The town council just approved the funds for a deputy," Delgado said, his tone casual, but his eyes were sharp. "The pay is not much, the work is hard. And there are men in this valley, ranchers with big spreads and bigger opinions, who will not like the sight of an Apache wearing a star." He let the warning hang in the air, "But the offer is there. If you want it, The offer was more than a job. It was a shield. It was legitimacy. For a man being hunted by a federal warrant, a local badge was a powerful countermove. It would make him part of the law, not just its target. "I will take it," Roman said without hesitation. The news of Roman's appointment spread through the town like a summer wind. The reactions were as mixed as the population itself. The Mexican and Apache families saw it as a sign of fairness from Delgado, a recognition of a man's worth over his blood. But just as the sheriff had predicted, a contingent of powerful Anglo ranchers, led by a hard-faced man named Silas Croft, made their displeasure known. They saw the law as their own, a tool to protect their property and their interests. And they did not like the idea of sharing it with a man they considered a savage. The lines of social conflict in Santa Esperanza were drawn not in the sand, but in the suspicious glances and muttered comments in the saloon. While Roman navigated the complex currents of his new position, Eliza found her own purpose. She saw the town's children, a wild, beautiful flock of all shades and backgrounds, with no school to shape their futures. An idea, bold and terrifying, took root in her heart. She was a woman of education. Her mind, so long suppressed in her marriage to Edwin, was her greatest asset. She could build something here. She presented her idea to Sheriff Delgado and the local store owner, a pragmatic man named Miller who served as the unofficial mayor. She proposed a small school, open to all the children of the town, regardless of their race. "They will learn to read and write English," she explained, her voice steady, though her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. "But they will also learn more. They will learn the stories of the desert that Roman's people tell. They will sing the Spanish songs their mothers sing. It will not be a place that erases who they are, but a place that helps them understand each other." Miller was skeptical, worried about the cost and the controversy, but Delgado, seeing the same quiet fire in her that he saw in her husband, supported her. The school was approved. They were given a disused storeroom behind the general store, and Eliza set to work, her spirits soaring with a sense of purpose she had never known. The small school became a symbol of the town itself, a fragile bridge between worlds, a place where the next generation might learn to cross the divides their parents could not. They rented a small, two-room adobe house at the edge of town. It was not much, but it was theirs. For the first time, they shared meals at a table, not beside a campfire. Eliza planted a small garden in the back, coaxing stubborn desert roses from the dry soil. In these quiet domestic moments, the marriage of necessity began to feel like something more. They were partners, building a life together brick by dusty brick. One afternoon, the mail rider, a wiry boy on a fast pony, brought a letter. It was addressed to Mrs. Eliza Moore, care of the sheriff, Santa Esperanza. Eliza's heart pounded as she took it. The handwriting was elegant, familiar. It was from her Aunt Matilda Hartwell in Boston, her mother's older sister. With trembling fingers, she opened it. The letter was short. Matilda had received a coded message Eliza had sent with a traveling merchant before fleeing Colorado. She was worried sick, and she was coming west to see her. The past was reaching for her again, not with the claws of a predator, but with the concerned hands of family. The thought filled her with both dread and a desperate, aching hope. As summer deepened, a drought settled over the valley. The sky remained a pitiless, empty blue. The creek shrank, and the land grew parched and brittle. The town well became the heart of the community, the one place everyone had to gather, sharing the precious, life-giving water. Tensions in the town rose with the heat. The ranchers' cattle grew thin, tempers frayed. The crisis came on a blistering hot afternoon. A storm had gathered over the mountains, but it was a dry storm. Spitting lightning, but no rain. A single bolt struck a patch of dry grassland miles from town, and the wind did the rest. A grass fire began to sweep across the valley, a hungry orange line devouring everything in its path, heading straight for the grazing lands that were the lifeblood of the ranchers. Panic erupted. Men grabbed buckets and shovels, but their efforts were chaotic and useless against the scale of the blaze. The fire was a living thing, roaring and crackling, sending a column of thick black smoke into the sky. It was Roman who brought order to the chaos. He was no longer just a deputy, he was a man in his element. He understood fire, he understood the wind, he understood the land. He rode to the front of the disorganized mob, his voice cutting through the noise and confusion. "Buckets will not stop this," he yelled. "We need a fire break. Now, Croft, your men have the best plows. Start a line from the creek bed to the Rock Ridge Miller. Get every wet blanket and sack you can find. We will beat back the edges." He gave orders with a calm, absolute authority that no one, not even Silas Croft, dared to question. In the face of this common enemy, old prejudices burned away. He showed them how to use the wind, how to anticipate the fire's movement. He worked alongside them, his face black with soot, his eyes red from the smoke, never stopping, never tiring. For hours, the entire town fought the blaze, a desperate, unified army led by the man many of them had scorned. By nightfall, the battle was won. A wide, black scar of a firebreak held the line, and the main blaze, deprived of fuel, slowly began to die down. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and scorched earth, but the town was safe. The grazing lands were saved. That night, in the saloon, there were no suspicious glances when Roman walked in. Men who had muttered behind his back now clapped him on the shoulder. Silas Croft, his face grim and smudged with soot, walked up to him and held out his hand. "Nantan," the rancher said, his voice rough. "I was wrong about you. You saved us today." Roman shook his hand. It was not friendship, but it was respect. And in a town like Santa Esperanza, respect was the more valuable currency. He had proven his place in the community not with the star on his chest, but with the knowledge in his head and the strength in his back. A fragile peace settled over the town, the peace of a community that had faced a crisis together and survived. Eliza's school was thriving. Roman was no longer just the Apache deputy, but a respected leader. It seemed, for the first time, that their desperate hope for a new life might actually be possible. The illusion was shattered a week later. A rider came into town late at night, his horse lathered and near collapse. It was the freighter, Alvarez, the man who had brought them the warning at the mission. He carried an urgent message from Padre Raphael. Roman met him in the sheriff's office, the single lamp casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. "He has given up on the law," Alvarez said, his voice grim and low. "Meant only for Roman and Delgado. Whitcomb, he knows the marriage is registered. He knows he cannot use a warrant anymore." Roman's body went still. "What has he done?" "He has hired them as a private army," the freighter said. "Slater and 20 other men. Hard cases. They are not coming here. They know you are the law here. They are waiting." He leaned forward, tracing a line on the dusty desk. "On the supply trail to Tucson, there is a canyon, 10 miles out. They call it Coyote Narrows. It is the only way through. They plan to wait for you there. They are not planning to arrest you, Roman. They are planning to bury you." The lamp in Sheriff Delgado's office cast a single pool of golden light on the dusty desk, leaving the corners of the room in deep shadow. The news from the freighter Alvarez settled between the three of them, heavy and cold as a tombstone. 20 men, a private army, sanctioned by nothing but Edwin Whitcomb's bottomless fortune and Burke Slater's venomous spite, an ambush waiting in the narrow throat of Coyote Narrows. Eliza stood beside Roman, her hand resting on his arm, not for support, but in solidarity. The woman who would have once collapsed in terror now stood her ground, her face pale, but her eyes clear and resolute. The desert and its hard lessons had burned away her fear, leaving behind a core of tempered steel. "We cannot stay here," Roman said, his voice a low, thoughtful rumble. "They would lay siege to the town. People would get hurt." "And you cannot run," Delgado added, leaning his considerable bulk back in his chair. "There is not a corner of this territory they would not eventually find you in." He looked from Roman to Eliza and back again. which means you have to go through them. The statement was stark, a death sentence delivered in a calm, practical tone. But Roman heard the unspoken words behind it. They will be expecting us to be on the run, Roman reasoned, thinking aloud. Desperate. 2 people against 20. They will be confident, arrogant. And that is where they will make their mistake. Delgado finished, a grim smile touching his lips. He stood up and walked to the small window, looking out at the quiet, sleeping town. You are not just a man on the run, Roman. You are a deputy of this town. An attack on you is an attack on the law of Santa Esperanza. He turned back, his eyes finding Roman's in the dim light. I cannot officially send you into a known ambush, but I can send a message. Chikawa and his band are camped in the Dragoon Mountains, less than a day's ride from the far side of the Narrows. He and I have an understanding, and he has not forgotten that you are brothers. The plan was a desperate gamble, a counter-trap laid within a trap. Roman and Eliza would ride out as planned, as if heading for Tucson for supplies, springing the ambush. They would have to hold their own, to survive against impossible odds. Long enough for help to arrive. It was a test of faith in a friend, and a test of their own will to live. The moon was a sharp, silver sliver in the black sky when they rode into Coyote Narrows 2 days later. The canyon walls rose up on either side of them, sheer cliffs of dark rock that seemed to press in on them, blotting out the stars. The air was still and cold, and the only sound was the soft clop of their horses' hooves on the sandy creek bed that served as the trail. A small stream, the canyon's lifeblood, trickled nearby, its surface catching the slivers of moonlight like a string of scattered diamonds. It was a beautiful, lethal place. Roman rode with his rifle across his lap, his senses stretched to their limit. He tasted the air, listened to the silence between the chirps of the night insects, watched the shadows for any movement that was not cast by the wind. Eliza rode just behind him, the revolver heavy on her hip, her heart hammered against her ribs. A steady, powerful rhythm. Not of fear, but of readiness. She was no longer a passenger in her own life. She was a combatant. The first shot came without warning, a whip crack of sound that echoed off the canyon walls, followed by the angry buzz of a bullet slicing the air where Roman's head had been a second before. In an instant, they were off their horses, moving with a practiced synchronicity. Roman returned fire into the muzzle flash from the rocks above, while Eliza pulled the horses into the cover of a thicket of scrub oak, her movement swift and efficient. Stay low. Move between the boulders. Roman's voice was calm, a sharp, clear command in the sudden chaos. Muzzle flashes erupted from a dozen places along the canyon rim. They were caught in a perfect crossfire. Eliza did not panic. She pressed herself against a large granite boulder, the cold stone a comfort against her cheek. She could hear Roman's teachings in her mind as if he were standing beside her. Breathe. Squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it. Hold the shoulder steady. She peered around the edge of the rock, found a target, a man's silhouette against the skyline. She raised the revolver with both hands, took a steadying breath, and squeezed. The gun bucked in her hands, the report loud in her ears. The silhouette vanished. She did not know if she had hit him, but she had driven him to cover. She had fought back. Roman moved like a spirit through the shadows. He was not trying to win a pitched battle. He was trying to survive, to disrupt their attack, to buy time. He fired, moved, and fired again, his shots deliberate and controlled. He was not the wild Apache of their racist imagination. He was the disciplined army scout, the calculating deputy. He aimed for limbs, for weapons, forcing them to keep their heads down, sowing confusion in their ranks. The night was filled with the cacophony of gunfire, the ricochet of bullets off rock, the shouted curses of unseen men. For what felt like an eternity, the two of them held off an army, their defiance a small, stubborn flame against an overwhelming darkness. But they were losing. The sheer volume of fire was pinning them down. They were trapped, It was then that a new voice, raw with arrogance and fury, cut through the din. "Enough of this, I want her alive." A figure rose from behind a massive rock formation on the canyon floor, a place that should have been safe. It was Edwin Whitcomb. In his madness and impatience, he had exposed himself, his face a pale mask of rage in the moonlight. He held a fancy, silver-inlaid pistol, a gentleman's weapon entirely out of place in this brutal landscape. "Eliza!" he screamed, his voice cracking with a possessive fury. "This is over! You are my property! I will not be defied by a savage and a runaway whore!" The world seemed to slow down. Roman saw him. He had a clear shot, an easy shot. In that split second, every injustice, every moment of fear, every mile they had run, coalesced into a single, burning point of rage. He could end it. He could kill the man who had tormented his wife, who had put a price on his head, who had brought this firestorm down upon them. Vengeance was a simple squeeze of the trigger away. But as he raised his rifle, he saw the glint of the deputy's star on his chest, saw the faces of the people of Santa Esperanza, saw Eliza's face, not filled with hate, but with a fierce, protective love. He was not a killer. He was the law. He shifted his aim by a fraction of an inch. The rifle cracked. Whitcomb shrieked, a high, thin sound of pain and shock. His silver pistol flew from his grasp, clattering against the rocks as he fell to his knees, clutching a hand that had been transformed into a bloody ruin. The momentary lull was shattered by a new sound, a sound that was not gunfire. It was the thunder of unshod hooves on stone, and it was coming from the far end of the canyon. A chorus of high, piercing cries echoed from the cliffs, a sound that struck a primal terror in the hearts of the hired gunmen. From the darkness, a wave of riders emerged, their forms lean and fluid in the saddle. They were Chiricahua Apache, and they rode with the fury of the storm. At their head was a man with a hawk-like face and eyes that burned with intensity, Chikawa. The arrival of the Apache warriors broke the back of the ambush. They swept through the canyon like a cleansing flood, their movements a whirlwind of controlled, deadly force. Slater's men, who had been paid to be bullies, not to fight a war, broke and ran. Some threw down their weapons, begging for their lives. Others scrambled into the rocks, only to be pursued by the relentless Apache. Roman rose from his cover and walked toward the whimpering, defeated figure of Edwin Whitcomb. He pulled the man to his feet and, with a grim satisfaction, bound his hands behind his back. The battle was over. Sheriff Delgado and a small posse arrived minutes later, their faces grim. Chikawa reined in his horse beside Roman, a silent nod of deep respect and enduring friendship passing between them. Together, the law of the town and the strength of the Apache had brought a different kind of justice to Coyote Narrows. As they were leading the captured gunmen away, Edwin Whitcomb, his face ashen and beaded with sweat, suddenly gasped. He clutched at his chest, his eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with his capture. He stumbled and fell to his knees, a choked, gurgling sound escaping his lips. "His heart," Delgado said, kneeling beside him. But there was nothing to be done. The poison of Edwin Whitcomb's own rage and hatred had finally stopped his heart. He had not been defeated by a bullet, but by the collapse of his own rotten core. In the confusion, a figure slipped away into the deepest shadows of the canyon. A voice, filled with a promise of unending hate, echoed from the rocks above. "This is not over. Nanta and I will see you in hell for this." It was Slater. He had escaped. Roman pulled Eliza close, holding her as the last of the echoes faded. They had won. They were alive. The creek at their feet shimmered in the moonlight, a silver path leading them out of the canyon of death, leading them back toward the fragile promise of home. The fight had been won, but Roman knew, as he looked into the darkness where Slater had vanished, that the war for their peace was not over yet. They returned to Santa Esperanza not as conquering heroes, but as survivors. The town greeted them with a quiet, profound respect that was more meaningful than any loud celebration. The story of Coyote Narrows spread through the valley, becoming a local legend almost overnight. They were the deputy and his wife who had faced down an army and won, not through brute force, but through courage, strategy, and the timely arrival of allies. The captured gunmen were held in the town's small jail, awaiting the long journey to the federal court in Tucson. News of Edwin Whitcomb's ignominious end on a dusty canyon floor followed shortly after. A final, grim period on a chapter of their lives. But the news was always followed by a question, whispered in the saloon in the general store. Where was Slater? The bounty hunter had vanished like a puff of smoke in the wind, leaving behind a silence that felt more menacing than any open threat. Life in Santa Esperanza settled into a new rhythm, the rhythm of healing and building. The shadow of violence had passed, leaving behind a cleaner, brighter sky. Roman's position as deputy was now unassailable, his authority cemented not just by his badge, but by the respect he had earned in the fire. Eliza's small school became the heart of the town's fragile peace, the site of Apache, Mexican, and Anglo children sitting together, learning their letters and then listening, rapt, as Eliza recounted one of Roman's desert stories, was a daily miracle, a quiet act of defiance against the harsh divisions of the world. The letter from Aunt Matilda had stated she would arrive on the late autumn stagecoach, and the day it was due. Eliza was a bundle of nerves. She had spent the morning pacing the floor of their small adobe house, smoothing the front of her best dress, a simple calico she had sewn herself. Roman watched her, his silence a comforting presence. "She will judge me," Eliza said, her voice tight. "She will see this house, this town. She will see you. She will think I have fallen into savagery." "Let her see," Roman said, his voice calm. "She will see a woman who is strong, a woman who is happy. If she cannot see that, then her eyes are the ones that are blind." When the stagecoach lumbered into town, trailing a plume of dust, a woman descended who was every inch the Boston matriarch Eliza had described. Matilda Hartwell was tall and slender, dressed in a severe, high-collared traveling dress of dark gray silk. Her silver hair was pinned in a tight, impeccable bun, and her back was as straight as a Boston steeple. She surveyed the dusty street of Santa Esperanza with an expression of faint, pained disapproval. Eliza's heart sank. But when Matilda's eyes found Eliza, the severe expression on her face cracked. For a moment, she looked not like a judge, but like a woman seeing a beloved ghost. She hurried forward, her gloved hands reaching for Eliza's. "Oh, my dear child," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion Eliza had not expected. "You are safe. That is all that matters." The reunion was a strange, formal affair conducted over tea in their small front room. Aunt Matilda sat stiffly on a wooden chair, her posture a silent rebuke to the rustic furniture, yet her eyes were soft as they followed Eliza's every move. She listened without interruption as Eliza, choosing her words carefully, told her a version of the story. She spoke of an unhappy marriage, of a desperate flight, of a kind man who had offered her protection. She did not speak of the violence or the terror. But Matilda, a woman who had spent a lifetime observing the subtle currents of human feeling, heard everything that was left unsaid. When Eliza finished, Matilda was silent for a long time. She looked at Roman, who sat quietly in the corner, a watchful guardian. She looked at the simple silver and turquoise ring on Eliza's finger. "When I was a young woman," Matilda said, her voice so soft Eliza had to lean forward to hear, "there was a man. He was a fisherman from Gloucester. Your grandfather forbade me to see him. He was not of our station. I was told it was my duty to marry a man of property and standing." She looked down at her own hands, at the ornate gold ring on her finger, the symbol of a long, respectable, and passionless marriage to a Boston banker. "I did my duty. I have regretted it every day of my life." She looked up, and there were tears glistening in her sharp, intelligent eyes. "You, my dear, did not make the same mistake. You chose life. You chose freedom. Your mother would have been so very proud." In that moment, the wall between them crumbled. Eliza wept, and her aunt held her, the stiff silk of her dress a surprising comfort. Later that evening, Matilda produced a thick envelope of legal documents from her trunk. "Your father was a more sentimental man than he let on," she explained. "He was never truly happy about your marriage to Whitcomb. He felt he had failed to protect you. Before he passed, he amended his will. He left you a small inheritance, a trust to be made available to you in your own right, separate from any husband. It is not a fortune, but he hoped it would be enough to give you a measure of independence." Eliza stared at the papers, at her father's spidery signature. It was enough. It was more than enough to buy the lumber and the books she needed, to add another room to the school, to hire a young Mexican woman to help her. It was enough to give her dream a solid foundation. The Santa Esperanza Bilingual School was no longer just an idea. It was a real possibility. A few weeks later, a new and quiet joy filled their small house. Eliza was pregnant. The discovery was a secret they kept to themselves for a time, a precious, fragile seed of hope. Eliza felt a deep, profound sense of rightness, of her body and her life finally coming into a peaceful alignment. But as her joy grew, she saw a shadow lengthen in Roman's eyes. He became quieter, more watchful. At night, she would wake to find him standing at the window, staring out at the desert as if expecting an attack. One evening, as they sat on their small porch, watching the stars emerge in the velvet sky, she finally asked him what was wrong. "I am afraid," he admitted, the words torn from him. It was a shocking confession from a man who seemed to fear nothing. "My people, we have lost so much. My father and mother. They were killed in a raid when I was a boy. Soldiers. They had a life, a family, and the world came and took it away. It feels dangerous to be this happy. It feels like I'm inviting history to repeat itself, to take away the people I love." His pain was so deep, so rooted in the history of his people, that Eliza felt helpless to soothe it. The next day, she sought out her aunt. She told her of Roman's fears. That afternoon, Matilda found Roman by the corral, mending a bridle. "Eliza tells me you are to be a father," she said, her tone direct. Roman nodded, his hands stilling their work. "She also tells me you are afraid." He did not deny it. He met her gaze, his own eyes filled with a quiet torment. "Let me tell you about Eliza's mother, my sister Margaret," Matilda said, her voice softening. "She was not a strong woman, physically. She was frail, often ill. But her spirit was like a river. It was gentle, but it was relentless. It could wear down stone. She loved a world that was often unkind to her with a fierce and unyielding passion. She brought beauty into every room she entered. She taught Eliza to see the poetry in the world, to love books, to be kind. That strength is in Eliza, and it will be in your child." She told him stories of Eliza's childhood, of her mother's quiet courage. She painted a picture of a legacy of feminine strength, a line of resilience that stretched from his own mother, the healer Alona, to Margaret, the gentle poet, and now to Eliza. He was not creating a target for tragedy. She helped him understand. He was forging a new link in a chain of survival. "You must give this child names that honor that chain," Matilda said. "A name for the healer who saved her mother, and a name for the mother who gave her a gentle heart." That night, as Roman read from his mother's journal by the light of a kerosene lamp, the words of the two women, Alona and Margaret, seemed to blend together in his mind. He looked at Eliza, her belly just beginning to swell with their child, and the fear in his heart was replaced by a powerful, humbling sense of purpose. He was not just a husband or a deputy. He was a guardian of a legacy. The desert roses Eliza had planted behind the house, which should have been dormant in the cooling air, suddenly burst into bloom. The delicate pink blossoms were a defiant splash of color against the brown earth, a symbol of a stubborn, unreasonable hope, a life that refused to follow the expected seasons. It felt like a benediction. The outside world intruded on their peace a month later. not with the violence of a gunman, but with the quiet authority of a man in a black suit. He arrived on the morning stage, a sober, humorless man from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He introduced himself as Mr. Fields and requested a meeting with the town leadership. He stood before them in the general store, his papers laid out neatly on the counter. He spoke of progress, of civilization, of a new government initiative to help the native children of the territory. The Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, he announced. His voice filled with a self-righteous certainty, is a beacon of hope. It is a place where these children can be lifted out of their unfortunate circumstances. They will be taught English, a trade, and the principles of Christianity. They will be given a chance to join modern American society. He looked around the room, at the faces of the Apache and Mexican parents, at Roman and Eliza. We are drawing up a list of the children in this district who are eligible for this wonderful opportunity, he said, a cold smile on his face. All native children, and those of mixed blood, will be required to attend. It is for their own good. It is the only way to sever them from the blanket and the teepee, to save them from the backward ways of their people. The words of the man from the Bureau of Indian Affairs fell into the silence of the general store like stones into a still pond, the ripples spreading outward in waves of shock and fear. Mr. Fields, with his black suit and his neat little stack of papers, represented a threat far more insidious than Burke Slater's hired guns. He came not with a revolver, but with the full, righteous authority of the United States government. He was not there to steal their lives, but to steal their children, all under the guise of progress. That evening, the town of Santa Esperanza gathered in the new, half-finished community hall. The air was thick with tension. Lanterns cast long, dancing shadows on the worried faces of Apache, Mexican, and Anglo parents alike. Mr. Fields stood at the front, calm and self-assured, ready to explain the benevolent logic of his plan. He spoke of a future where Indian children would be indistinguishable from their white counterparts, a future where their native tongues were silenced and their cultural roots severed for their own good. When he finished, a heavy silence filled the room. It was Eliza who broke it. She stood up, her hand resting on her swelling belly, a simple, protective gesture. All eyes turned to her. The town schoolteacher. "Mr. Fields," she began, her voice clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the hall. "You speak of opportunity, but what is the value of an opportunity that costs a child his own soul, that tells him his parents are ignorant and his ancestors' ways are savage?" She looked around the room, at the faces of her students' parents. "In my school, the children learn to read and write English. Yes, but they also learn the Apache names for the stars. They learn the Spanish songs that have been sung in this valley for 100 years. They learn that a person can hold two worlds in their heart, not just one. You say you want to save them from the blanket. We want to give them a world where they do not have to choose between a blanket and a book." A murmur of assent rippled through the crowd. Roman stood beside her, his presence a silent, powerful anchor. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "A plant cannot grow if you cut it from its roots," he said, his words simple and profound. "It will wither and die. A child is the same. If you take them from their people, from their land, you are not giving them a future. You are stealing their past and leaving them with nothing." Sheriff Tom Delgado, who had been leaning against the back wall, pushed himself forward. "This is a town of the law, Mr. Fields," he said, his voice a low growl. "And the law is here to protect its citizens, not to tear families apart. These people are not wards of the state. They are residents of Santa Esperanza, and I will not stand by and see their children taken from them against their will." From the side of the room, another voice joined the chorus. It was Padre Raphael, who had ridden in from his mission as soon as he heard the news. "The Lord's commandment is to honor thy father and thy mother," the old priest said, his voice ringing with moral authority. "It is a sin to teach a child to be ashamed of their own blood. Education should be a light that illuminates a child's path. not a fire that burns the bridge to their home. The opposition was formidable, but Mr. Fields was a man of procedure and bureaucracy. He held up a hand. "Your local sentiments are noted," he said, his tone dismissive, "but this is a federal directive. I have the authority." "Do you?" A crisp, clear voice cut in. All heads turned to the back of the room, where Aunt Matilda Hartwell stood, her posture as rigid and unyielding as a Boston monument. "Do you indeed have the authority to forcibly remove children without due process? In direct violation of their rights as citizens of this territory, I have been in correspondence with Senator Dawes's office and with the War Department, under which the Bureau operates. They seem to be under the impression that this program is strictly voluntary. I have a feeling they would be most interested to hear about your more aggressive interpretation of the policy." Matilda held up a sheaf of telegrams. She had not been idle. While the town prepared for a battle of hearts and minds, she had been preparing for a battle of paper and politics. She had unleashed a volley of inquiries and veiled threats upon Washington, using connections her family had cultivated for generations. The community, seeing their chance, rallied. A petition was drawn up that night, on the rough counter of the general store. It was signed by everyone, by the Mexican merchants, by the Apache elders, and, in a moment that solidified the town's new unity, by Silas Croft and the other Anglo ranchers who now saw an attack on one family as an attack on them all. Faced with a unified and defiant community, a sheriff who would not cooperate, and the unexpected political firestorm ignited by a well-connected woman from Boston, Mr. Fields found his position untenable. 2 days later, he boarded the stagecoach, his face a mask of sour defeat. "This matter is not concluded," he stated stiffly. "It is merely postponed." But everyone knew they had won. They had faced a different kind of enemy, not with guns, but with a united voice, and they had protected their own. Months passed. The chill of late autumn gave way to a mild winter. The new wing of the Santa Esperanza Bilingual School began to take shape, built with lumber from the inheritance and with the volunteer labor of the townspeople. And in the small adobe house with the desert roses out back, Roman and Eliza's daughter was born. She was a beautiful, healthy child with Eliza's fair skin and Roman's dark, watchful eyes. They named her Alona Margaret, for the two women, the Apache healer and the Boston poet, whose legacies of strength and love had guided them to this new life. One night, when the moon was full and the air was cool and clean, Roman wrapped the sleeping baby in a warm blanket. He looked at Eliza, a question in his eyes. She understood. Without a word, they saddled their horses and rode out from the town, leaving the flickering lights of Santa Esperanza behind them. They rode through the silent desert, the landscape transformed into a dreamscape of silver and shadow under the full moon. They did not stop until they reached a familiar place, the shallow cut of Bitter Wash. It was here, in this very spot, that their journey had begun. The water in the creek was a ribbon of pure, liquid moonlight. Roman dismounted and helped Eliza down. He handed her the sleeping bundle of their daughter, and together they walked to the water's edge. They stepped into the creek, the cool water swirling around their ankles. It was the same water, the same moonlight, but they were not the same people. "This is the place where I first called you my wife to save us," Roman said, his voice a low murmur in the vast quiet. "Tonight, it is the place where we choose each other, to live." He looked down at the tiny, perfect face of his daughter, and then at Eliza, his wife in truth, not just in name. His heart was so full it felt as if it might break. "I took you as my Apache bride by fate," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But that night, in the mission, I saw that your spirit was untouched, that your innocence was as pure as the snow on the mountains, and I chose to wait for our season, for this." Eliza reached out and touched his face, her eyes shining with tears that were not of sorrow, but of a deep, abiding joy. "Because of you." "Roman," she said, her voice soft as the desert wind. "That snow was not trampled. It melted into water for the desert of my life." He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss of profound tenderness and belonging. In the distance, a lone coyote called to the moon, its voice a wild and beautiful song of survival. Near the bank, a hardy desert rose, a descendant of the ones Eliza had planted, released its sweet fragrance into the night air. The future was not certain. Slater was still out there, a shadow on a distant horizon. The world and its harsh demands would surely return. But in that moment, standing in the water where they were first joined by fate, they were a family, rooted and strong, ready for whatever seasons were to come. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We invite you to comment with where you are listening from in the world so we can all connect. And please remember to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so more people can discover this tale.